And coming up on this week's show, the Prime Minister announces £415 million of investment in railways in the north. But what's the real story? Virgin Trains moves a step closer to challenging Eurostar. But it's still a long way off being a done deal. And passenger numbers are increasing, but revenue is still lagging miles behind. We investigate. And welcome to Green Signals from me, Nigel Harris, and...
from me, Richard Bowker.
Let's go, shall we, Richard? Straight into it with some big stuff. You've been busy. And we start this week with the Prime Minister's dramatic announcement last week regarding railways in the north of England. Sir Keir made a big set-piece speech in Huddersfield, and the press release from Number 10 included these dramatic statements. Major package of investment to revive Victorian-era transport system in the north. People across the north will no longer be held back by a broken transport system and empty promises. The Prime Minister said that as he announced more funding to deliver the largest rail investment in the north in decades. This transformatory package to reboot the north's creaking transport system means government more than double, which means, that's right, they actually missed some words on the press release. They can't even get that right. But we presume they meant to add, is spending more than double on local transport in the north compared with the south and London. And if they got that wrong, what else have they missed?
I know. It doesn't even stop there, right? They said for the key line between Manchester, Huddersfield, Leeds and York, which we all know as TransPennine, of course, and they said, which has been plagued by disruption and delays for years without a plan to fix it.
Yawn.
Well, that's just clearly not true. The route will now be supported with $415 million in funding from government to restore its failing services. And then they said, this funding boost includes a mass transit system for West Yorkshire progressing with the next stage of the business case expected in the autumn, bringing growth to the largest city in Europe without a metro transport system, by which I presume they mean Leeds. A new Merseyrail station in the Baltic Triangle, better connecting the city to Britain's coolest neighbourhood, starting works this autumn and complete by spring 28. And they said, the Bury interchange redevelopment fast-tracked with £80 million to improve bus and tram connectivity across Greater Manchester.
Well, we're clearly meant to be gobsmacked and excited by all this, aren't we, Richard?
We're not.
Pray what? This new plan? What have we missed? What is this renaissance, good word, in the north? So, is Cinderella finally going to the ball?
Well, not quite in the way that the Prime Minister, I think, would like us to believe, Nigel. This is quite a remarkable story, and the press release is quite incredible. It's worth just focusing on rail, because that's obviously what we're interested in. And because it was part of a wider sort of growth thing. But if we focus on rail and unpack it, so they, as we've pointed out there, Number 10 and the Prime Minister focused on a number of schemes. And it appears to be, and he clearly appears to be trying to give us the impression this is all dramatic and new stuff and, as you said, a renaissance. So, light rail for West Yorkshire. It's been announced so many times.
Yeah.
It's really hard to keep track. I think the last time was when it was included as part of the Network North package that came out when HS2 was cancelled to Manchester.
Yeah, the dreadful, wretched Grant Shapps Network North document that actually, I was anticipating this, Richard, you'll be pleased about that. And the Network North document actually said this regarding the Leeds tram, quote, we will enable the West Yorkshire Mayor to take forward a fully funded £2.5 billion mass transit metro in West Yorkshire. This ensures that Leeds will no longer be the largest city in Europe without a mass transit system. This could create a transformative network of up to 7 lines, which could eventually connect Leeds with Huddersfield, Wakefield, Bradford and Halifax, coming into operation well before HS2 would have reached the region. What say you?
Well, there's many things that we can accuse Grant Shapps of, including, for instance, the disintegrated rail plan, as I called it at the time. But bizarrely, the Network North debacle was under Mark Harper's leadership rather than Grant Shapps, which just goes to show how, I think,
I'm thinking of the integrated rail plan, aren't I?
Which is the one I just call the disintegrated rail plan.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No. But it's a great point. It just shows just how over a number of years we've had a sort of like a succession of fairly average secretaries of state for transport. And obviously, Chris Grayling before that, and he didn't have the greatest of times.
I have to say, Richard, that was very elegantly corrected there when I got that wrong.
It's my pleasure. That's what we do. We're a team on this show. But in this latest announcement, Nigel, that bit about the going back to Leeds trams and the light rail, they only talk about actually going to the next stage of a business case, which is kind of what I would expect, to be honest.
But what happened to the fully funded bit?
Well, there you go, right? So in the Network North document, they talked about fully funded. They actually knew they would need a business case, but it almost feels like this time we've gone backwards and still made it sound like we've gone forwards, which is quite clever. They also talk about a Baltic Triangle station. Now, that actually is not a new thing at all. That was and is funded by a wonderful thing called the City Region Sustainable Transport Settlement, which I know is easy for me to say. CRSTS, right? And the last one of those was in 2022. So Baltic Triangle was in that. So it's been going on for like a long time now, because the scheme was £50 million, over £50 million, which it is. The Department of Transport retained the right to sign off the business case. That's exactly the same with Bury Interchange redevelopment. So if you look at the letters that were sent to Steve Rotherham by Grant Shapps, there you go.
That's why his name's in my head, because I've been reading the letters. Yeah, it all blurs.
To Andy Burnham at the time in 2022, they both mention, first Baltic Exchange and then Bury, and make it clear that the department will have to be involved in signing off the business case. Now, I guess that's what's just happened, and that's not a bad thing. That's great. But the notion that this is new is wrong. These have been around for absolutely ages. But the worst, I think, and it's just my opinion, right? Others will have their own view, is the TransPennine upgrade. Now, according to this press release, the positioning was the narrative is this is £415 million of new money to do some wonderful things.
More than in London.
The total spend more than London. And from a government that quotes to restore its failing services, our failing services in the north. I mean, they never miss an opportunity to kick all those people who are working so hard to try and deliver a good service. And that is
a really important point, which we ought to emphasise, I think.
Yeah, it's not very helpful, but there you go. He's making a political point.
Isn't it a bit like saying the floggings will continue until morale improves?
There's a bit of that, isn't there? But the truth of this 415 million is really rather dull. So prior to the announcement that was made by Number 10, the TransPennine route upgrade, which is a huge project, right? This is a massive thing that's going on, was funded to the tune of 6.9 billion. Now it's funded to 7.3 billion. It's got this 400 million, but which is great, but it's a bit like having a house building project where it's going to cost you, say, £500,000, but you've only got 400,000 to begin with. You then get the rest of the money. You don't build a bigger house. You can afford to do the project that you always wanted to do and you were planning to do.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. So, I've got it on from an impeccable source. The scope has not changed, right? There's nothing new coming out now in TransPennine route upgrade because of this. It just means that they're now funded for more than they were funded before. Not a bad thing. It's a good thing, but it's not a new thing. And I think that's the point about this release.
And yet, sorry, while I bestride my hobby horse, the mainstream media fell for it hook, line and sinker, either from incompetence or laziness, with many outlets simply repeating what was in the press release without going to any trouble to find out whether it actually represented fact. They all want about, the reporter's told it's raining, not his job to report it, but go to the window and look. Nobody went to the window, apart, it would seem, from our research or your research. Shout out to the Manchester Evening News, who in fairness did check the announcement and came up pretty much with the same conclusions that we did. So well done to the MEN.
Yeah, no, they were very good. And I suppose it's important to stress, there's not the things that were in number 10's press release, they are all happening. They're just not new things. And this notion that, now that we've become the government, now we're getting to grips, we're going to sort this mess out. We've poured all this extra money, made all these big decisions. Sorry, guys, these things were happening. And yes, you may have ticked a certain box, but it was not positioned.
But it is misleading. Accurately. And if an independent press is for anything, it's to hold government's feet to the fire and speak truth to power and say, that is nonsense.
Well, the good news is
we are.
We now have green signals when it comes to railway stuff to do precisely that.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Our bullshit detector is always set to fine, isn't it? Did I say that out loud then? I think I did.
Possibly.
Okay. Some big news this week, or so it seemed. Virgin won a significant victory in its quest to compete with Eurostar on cross-channel services. So many listeners wrote to us about this one. It obviously engages people. Steve Roberts, John Kirkman, Stephen Bates, to name but three, but thank you to everybody else. Regular listeners and viewers will record that Virgin had announced they were seeking up to £700 million in funding to develop and launch services on HS1 and through the Channel Tunnel. But a stumbling block was access to the light maintenance depot at Temple Mills in East London. Well, on March 31st, ORR published its initial findings, which seemed to suggest there may indeed be some spare capacity. The headline in the ORR release said, "The Office of Rail and Road says Eurostar's London depot would be able, if required, to accommodate additional trains following its receipt of an independent report it commissioned to investigate the matter." Virgin, of course, went into PR hyperdrive. We're all familiar with that, aren't we, Richard? And issued a press release that boomed. Finally, a green signal. We did like that, though, didn't we?
We did like that one, yeah. Thank you, Virgin. Yeah.
For competition. The Temple Mills depot is the only facility in the UK which can accommodate European-style trains, and claims suggesting it was at capacity have been blocking Virgin from coming to the line. Virgin is therefore very pleased with the outcome, and we thank the ORR for commissioning this report, which will now unlock competition on the cross-channel route for the benefit of all passengers. There are no more major hurdles to overcome, and Virgin is ready to take up the challenge given its award-winning experience in the train industry and track record for building globally successful travel brands. We expect to be able to make an announcement very soon. Watch this space! ! Close quotes. Were you excited, Richard?
I love the exclamation mark at the end of that. It was brilliant, wasn't it?
I had to mention it.
You can't. The great thing about Virgin press statements is that they just exude confidence and sort of, excitement. And
they do.
And you definitely, we kind of, in this world at the moment, we probably need a bit more of that. But it's not quite as straightforward as it's perhaps being presented. Yeah, well, I'm sorry to be pouring a little bit of cold water on it. But there are a couple of things just to bear in mind. First of all, these are the ORR's initial findings, right? There's now going to be a consultation period, which runs to the end of April. So there's a month. It's not like 6 months or anything, but there is a period by which all interested parties, and that includes Eurostar, can comment on what it says in this report. And we can already see where Eurostar are coming from. They said in their press statement of March 31st, they said this: Eurostar welcomes this independent study by the Office of Road and Rail. It confirms what Eurostar has said all along. The Temple Mills depot is effectively almost full today for major maintenance work and would require investment to meet the growing demands of international rail. And then they say, the options presented in the report could help create some capacity, but this would not be enough to accommodate the stated ambitions of any single operator. This includes the 3 organisations who have applied to the regulator and the needs of Eurostar itself. Eurostar has complied fully with the regulatory process and will continue to do so. This is in advance of any train orders being placed and years ahead of those, my emphasis, by the way, and years ahead of those trains being built and needing to access Temple Mills. There you go.
Blimey, and presumably, since it's not just Virgin who are interested in the capacity, we have Evelyn and Gemini as well. They will all be making representations as part of the ORR's consultation into its initial findings. Lawyers, gird up your loins. Well, I see that they welcome the ORR's initial finding as well. Incidentally, I was at that depot at Temple Mills when it opened, I think in 2008. Tom Harris was the rail minister. And have you ever been? It's astonishing.
I have. No, I have been.
It can accommodate full trains. It just goes to a dot in the distance. It's a quarter of a mile long.
Yeah, 400-metre long trains. But it's you're absolutely right. There's Virgin, Evelyn and Gemini. They all want access to it. Everybody's got well, I say everybody. Virgin, Gemini and Evelyn are certainly, I saw the Gemini press release. They said pretty much the same as Virgin, though in a slightly less sort of dramatic way. Eurostar have obviously taken their own view of this, and it's quite different. Well, they can't all be absolutely right, can they? And even once you get access to Temple Mills, if you want to run a service to, say, Paris, let's pick that as an example, there's the small matter of securing an access contract to run on HS1, which will be approved or directed by the ORR. You've got to purchase or lease trains, which are technically compatible for HS1 and the Channel Tunnel, and actually for Temple Mills Depot, right? That's got to be authorised by the ORR. You need a licence to operate trains in Great Britain. That's issued by the ORR. You need a safety certificate confirming you are capable of operating safely across all of the infrastructure. That's issued by the ORR. And there will be equivalents for all the other regulatory jurisdictions in
Belgium and France.
In European railways. Now, well, there is coordination between ORR and its regulatory counterparts in the EU on those matters to help applicants in the process. But the point being, there's still an awful lot to do. Now, I'm not saying that Virgin, or indeed for that matter, any of the others, haven't done those things or aren't well advanced. I mean, that might be why Virgin's able to say big announcement coming soon. But others may have done those things as well. I just think my instinct is, given what Eurostar has said, given what everybody else is saying, there's a lot of water to pass under a few bridges before anyone gets close to being able to say that they're going to be running a new service in competition to Eurostar, which incidentally I think would be a good thing. But I think there's quite a way off.
So do I, Rich. I also think it's just worth briefly pointing out that of all those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bullet points of big hurdles to overcome, for me, the biggest is the fact that you've got to have special trains for the Channel Tunnel Safety Authority, because of the fire risk and all the rest of it. You can't just go to Germany or France and hire or lease or buy some existing trains. They have to comply. And that's one of the biggest reasons why we've still never seen any other competitor running through the Channel Tunnel, because, you know, even though there are longer tunnels under the Alps, they're not underwater. So the restrictions are huge.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of boxes to tick, that's for sure. But there are trains out there that can do it, so because they run today, and you know, and but yes, you're right that they've still got that hurdle to cross.
But at least ORR has said there may be capacity, and surely that's positive.
Yeah, no, it is positive because, as I said just now, I think competition on this route is a good thing. One thing, just to say, I mean, the independent consultant that did this report on Temple Mills, they're called IPEX. They actually said, in their view, there is latent, i.e. spare capacity of between 4 to 8 train sets at Temple Mills in the kind of normal operating mode. And why does it say 4 to 8? Because it's spread over a 24-hour period. So sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's more. And yet when you read Virgin's Section 17 application, that's the thing that they submitted to the ORR because they couldn't reach agreement with Eurostar in the first place. It does seem to suggest they actually need more than that. So I asked Virgin, and they said, no, actually, we can cope with 4 roads at Temple Mills. So, okay. But my gut instinct from reading that report, and it is an absolute mind bender. We'll put a link to it on our website, but it is pretty tough. I've always found fleet operations quite challenging technically. But when you read it, you are left with a sense, or I was, that IPEX are saying, yeah, there is some spare capacity, but it will be absolutely bursting at the seams. And you probably need to spend a bit of more money to make any more. So it feels to me like it's right on the limit. That's presumably what was behind Eurostar's statement. But either way, there's so much to come with this. I don't think we should be inquiring just yet about your anybody but Eurostar ticket to Paris. I think there's quite a lot still to do.
Indeed. Okay, well, let's move on and see if there's any more cold water left in your bucket, Richard. For our
I've got an unlimited supply of cold water down here. Don't worry.
for our next story, we see regular comments in the press and on social media bemoaning the fact that if only we had a railway like Switzerland, or France, or Germany, or Belgium, life would be marvellous. Price often comes up, oh, it's so much cheaper to travel on trains in whatever country you mention, and they're always on time. But we know it's much more complex than that. To find out how complex, Richard spoke with John Ciro, senior economist at Jacobs.
I did. And just one thing, just to explain to people, in this discussion with John, he uses a word called hypothecate when he's talking about, I think it's a sort of a French payroll tax. And just in case anyone wonders, hypothecate means a tax that you raise and then spend the proceeds of it on one specific thing that you made clear to begin with. You don't just stick it into the general pot. You do a tax and say, I will raise this tax and I will only spend it on public transport or that. So that is what hypothecation is. And here's what John had to say. Well, welcome to Green Signals, John. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. Is it even possible to compare what happens in this country, Great Britain, with, say, the Netherlands or Germany? Or is it just too complicated to actually have that kind of common basis of comparison?
It's incredibly complicated, and a whole load of simplifying assumptions really have to be undertaken to get to any sort of comparison. The way that the railways are subsidized across Europe varies, the pricing structure varies, the whole of the finance of the railway industry varies from country to country. So it's very complicated to provide a sort of really accurate comparison, and all the comparisons you'll ever see are full of caveats, including my own, about the assumptions that have been taken into account. But it gives you a broad picture, I think, and that's what we're trying to show is what at a broad level are the major comparisons between the various European countries.
Okay, so the broad picture then would suggest that, notwithstanding those differences, and they might actually be really quite material, the UK has a higher percentage coming from the fare box than in some other countries, which we kind of always sort of suspected. But is that fair? The UK expects its passengers, its customers, to pay more of their ticket than perhaps in other countries.
Yeah, I think we've had governments of various persuasions have decided to move to the fact that the users of the rail system should be a major contributor towards the cost of providing that rail service, and that's been a policy for a very long period of time. So in general, we do end up paying more as a passengers to use our rail network than some other countries. It's worth noting, however, that the data which I showed in the chart on LinkedIn only includes public service obligation services, and vast majority of services in Great Britain are PSO services, the same in most other countries, but there are some exceptions. So France and Germany, for example, their high-speed services are not PSO, and there you're seeing effectively passenger fares covering the tickets, the cost of providing the service. But again, it gets complicated about how track access charges are determined and whether subsidies go into the track access charges rather than directly to the train operating companies.
When you actually look at total revenues and total subsidy, I've always taken the view that in the UK, it's either come from fares or subsidy, really, for passenger services. There's no really other source of money. But my understanding is that not necessarily the case in other countries. And do you think that is an indication of where we need to go next in this country and actually start to diversify our income?
Yeah, so in my view, there are sort of four major sources of revenue for the rail industry. The importance of each of those varies by country due to historical reasons and various other reasons. So, as you say, the fare box is obviously the key one. There's then the level of subsidy that goes into the rail industry. And again, there are different ways of how that subsidy gets paid over. So in France, for example, there's a payroll tax, which is hypothecated to public transport use. And you could argue that is some ways a cost of providing a service for employers to get their employees to work or their customers to their place of where they're selling their stuff. So they're the sort of two key ones. Then the question of freight. We're both too young, I'm sure, to remember the 1960s in Britain. But if you go back that far, rail freight actually generated most of the revenues rather than passengers. And what we've seen around is a massive turnaround in the UK where freight revenues have diminished substantially compared to passenger revenues. That's not the case in some European countries. And some European countries, Austria, Germany spring to mind, something like a quarter to a third of revenues come in from freight. And there's a case of, again, depending on how freight is being charged for their track access, is freight partially subsidizing passenger services. And then there's the whole ancillary services and ancillary revenues that are potentially available to train operating companies. So pre-COVID, our train operating companies generated something like 10% of their revenues through those ancillary services, whether that's onboard catering, whether that's advertising at the stations they control, car parking revenues, etc. If you look at some other countries, and the biggest one examples are in the Southeast Asia, so you look at Japan, you look at Hong Kong, there you might argue that some of their railway stations are actually shopping malls or office blocks with a few platforms attached. Something like a third of their profits come from those property and ancillary services. So depending, as I say, which country you're in, depends on that split of revenues and depends on how you're going to drive those revenues going forward. And I think there's a good comparison with the airline industry. So again, most major airports are shopping malls and car parks with a piece of tarmac attached, which your planes take off from. Ryanair takes about a third of its revenues through ancillary services, whether that's commission on selling you insurance or hotel bookings or car hire, whatever. And I think as the railway moves more into the leisure market, we need to start building up those ancillary revenues to offset that loss in business revenues that the railways have suffered in post-COVID.
And that actually that's fascinating. I hadn't realised quite some of those percentages, particularly not in places like Japan. That's really interesting. But this is becoming critical, isn't it, John? Because if you look at the recent ORR data on sort of passenger demand and journeys and revenue, at one level you can say actually it's really quite positive. There's been some growth. So we just had the October to December 2024 numbers. Year on year to the previous year, it's up. That's good. However, you pointed out in another post, you said, yeah, but hang on a minute. Long distance train operating companies' revenues at constant prices, that's important, are still at 2011 numbers. We're still that far behind. So yes, we've got some growth, but we're a long way behind. And that kind of feels like it's going to be a real struggle to catch up for long distance because presumably it's a much more leisure focused railway now and the yields. So although we've got passengers, our yields are down. So that suggests these ancillary revenues aren't a nice to have. They're going to be absolutely critical. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. If you look at the West Coast, especially on a morning peak period, those first class passengers, those business passengers paying full fares just aren't there to the same extent as they were pre-COVID. And you've lost, therefore, huge amounts of revenue, even though passenger numbers are, broadly back to where they were. But as you say, the average yields has diminished substantially. So the question is, how do you upsell your leisure passengers to take a premium product, whether that's first class or whether you start selling them packages linked into hotels, theatres, bookings, whatever it might be, to drive those additional commissions, to drive that additional ancillary revenues. Because if we don't do that, we're going to really struggle filling that revenue gap that we've seen post-COVID. We've got the passenger numbers back, but we haven't got the revenues back.
Fascinating. And then we come full circle into where we started, which is if you're the government, you go, well, look, it's fares or subsidy in this country. I accept your point about there's other sources in other countries, but in this country, primarily fares and subsidies. So we haven't got any more subsidy. So if you ain't going to get the fares, guys, you're going to have to find other ways of doing it. And that brings us sort of back full circle, doesn't it? It's going to be a challenging and different way of financing train companies in the future. Presumably, you don't see it changing any other way.
No, and I think the key challenge is how do we fill up those empty spaces on our trains? There's still a lot of trains with lots of capacity available.
Yeah.
How do we encourage people to get back on those trains and to generate that revenue? Because, as you said, the figures are looking pretty good. I think it was about 8% year-on-year growth in real terms, which is pretty impressive. If you keep going for a few more years, potentially you're out of the woods, but you've got to get more people on trains and you've got to increase the yields on those from those passengers. So it's identifying ways of actually being more clever about selling that capacity that we've got on the network.
I think we have just probably confirmed what we already knew, which is it's jolly complicated and comparisons are difficult. But no, that's really interesting insight and appreciate your time with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure, Richard.
So there you go. That was John's view. Really interesting.
It was.
He does produce some absolutely brilliant graphs, which he posts on LinkedIn regularly. And I always find myself going, oh, I didn't really realize that. That point about hypothecation is relevant because governments, certainly this Treasury here, really dislike it. What they want is to be able to get all the money and then decide how to spend it, right? So don't everybody get carried away with that. Although there are examples with things like land value capture and tax incremental financing, which could end up being helpful in building new railways in this country. So watch this space. Now, interestingly, on the revenue point, regular listener Jim Millington, who listens to Green Signals, sent me a rather interesting graph that he'd produced using ORR data, which showed this revenue gap that John and I were talking about rather starkly. Now, Jim is qualified to talk about this. He was an economist at Atkins, and he specializes in revenue forecasting, right?
So we can take it really seriously.
Yeah, but what I did do, though, because I always like to just check stuff myself, just to make sure that I've understood it, I reproduced the graph that Jim had sent from the ORR data, and guess what? Got exactly the same result. So nice one, Jim. I never doubted it, but there you go. And the graph, which we'll put on our website so you can have a look at, there's two graphs. One shows the ORR's analysis of passenger journeys. And although we're not quite back to pre-COVID levels, because just before COVID, total passenger journeys was 1.739 billion. It's now at 1.612 billion, or it was at the end of 2024. It is growing, and actually it's grown quite steeply. So that suggests, more people are traveling by train again. It's coming back. The problem is revenue. And if you look at the second graph that we've put on our website, it shows industry revenue. It shows two quite dramatic things, actually. One, it shows that season ticket and full fare tickets were actually slowing in terms of their rate of growth before COVID, right? So then there was almost kind of a bit of a migration happening. COVID arrives and just basically blows everything out of the water. And since then, it's the leisure, it's the off-peak, it's the advanced fares which have really grown. And so now, although ridership is not far off, the revenue gap is still about 15%. I mean, in the last quarter, it was 3.5 billion, I think, plays 2.9. That is a huge gap. So the industry's got a real issue. And that's why John's comments about diversified income and alternative income sources are really, really important, because I'm not sure it's all going to come from just fares.
The excellent Anthony Smith was pointing out exactly that before COVID, Richard, that flexible working had largely robbed people of the requirement for season tickets, and the off-peak returns, 3 a week, were
Right.
really going up. And I understand as well that there's nowhere near as much of the lucrative first-class business travel, and there's because you mentioned some numbers before we started recording that were quite
So
revealing.
in the last quarter it was 2.9 billion. Plays what it was in the same sort of prior to COVID, which was 3.5. So it's a £600 million gap, which is about 15%. I mean, it's a big deficit, and at the moment, of course, that's being effectively funded by subsidy, because in the UK there are really those two primary sources. There are other sources in other places. I mean, I was quite surprised by the comment about freight, for instance, in other countries. But here, it's primarily fares and subsidies. So that gap is being picked up by the taxpayer at the moment.
Yet the costs continue to rise against the
costs continue to rise.
Okay. Even I get that one, Richard.
Brilliant.
And now it's time to thank everyone who supports us. First of all, our thanks to RIA, the Railway Industry Association, our programme supporter, and to Rail Business Daily, our media supporter. And they feature us editorially at the minute, don't they? Thanks, guys. Your support, as ever, is hugely appreciated. And then a big thank you to everyone who's left us a super thanks on YouTube this week. And it's a good old list, and you great people are Edmund Carew, Alan Kirkman, Bob Walsh, John Kirkman, Nigel Mapston, Chris Exley, Graham Whitley, Sean Harris, Alistair Rutledge, Anthony Chalice, Maxstar 2010, and the Independent Brigline Rail Group. We really do appreciate so many of you leaving us super thanks. So thank you very much indeed from Stef, from Richard and myself. We do value it enormously.
We do indeed. I mean, just back on the Rail Business Daily comment you made there, Nigel, in this month's Rail Director, which is a magazine that they produce, there's a 2-page spread, an interview with
you and me.
You and me, yeah, absolutely fantastic. They've done a fabulous job.
They
of it.
have.
They've even made us look, quite good. It's a really great article. So I think we can put a link to that on the website as well. But so that was Rail Director. Thank you, guys. And thanks to all our members who you can see listed in the end credits of the show. If you're a gold or silver member, please drop us an email to info@greensignals.org so we can get stuff out to you. I'm up to date now with members' mugs, but there must still be about a dozen where I don't have the ability to send people's mugs because I don't have an address. So please, if you haven't done that, do send it. Quick shout out to our merchandise store at greensignals.etsy. That's ETSY.com. Or you can simply click the link in the description. We've got loads of cool stuff, including T-shirts, travel mugs, stickers. People have started sending us some really cool photos of their merch, Nigel. We had a lovely one from Alan Barnes of his travel mug in the cab of number 17, the Diema Diesel, I think I pronounced that right, and a really nice one from Andy Fisher of his enamel mug when he was on duty in a signal box. So that is fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. And any more pictures, and if we're happy to show them, but really appreciate that.
Green Signals merch reaches the parts that other merch does not reach.
Absolutely right.
And now it's time for this week's Railway News Roundup. Locals near Wareham Station in Dorset have won their campaign to keep a pedestrian crossing that they fought long and hard against Network Rail to save from closure, as it provides step-free access across the line. Network Rail has been planning to close the crossing since 2012, but residents have staged protests, and even film actor Edward Fox, who lives locally, even got involved to support the campaign. Dorset Council has apparently been paying £120,000 to staff manually operated gates to stop people crossing in front of trains. This was following people ignoring red lights and crossing in front of approaching trains before the manual gates were installed in 2010. A Network Rail planning application to install ramps up to an existing footbridge was refused in 2018. The Council and Network Rail have now finally agreed that the current arrangement should continue. And thanks to David Redgewell for sending us that one. Just before we move on, Richard, they've also got a pedestrian crossing at Stamford because there's no foot access there to the Leicester-bound platform. Very sharp curve, trains and particularly freights approach at speed. There is a foot crossing there, and you pick up a phone and you ring the signaller in the Midland box at Ketton, and he presses the buttons and sees you across and asks you to ring from the other side sometime or watches on the cameras. So it is possible to do this thing. Now, I suppose it depends how busy the crossing is, but I'm sure the Stamford one doesn't cost 120,000 quid a year to run.
Don't know, but they're a bit of a. I don't know what I feel about this really. I don't naturally like passengers going across foot crossings, but anyway, that's this one has been a campaign, and Network Rail and the County Council have agreed to continue with it. LNER has carried out its first ever test run. Wait for this, from Leeds to London St Pancras.
I didn't know this.
Well, the idea was to carry out various safety and validation checks to look at the potential of offering passengers more options and freedom to travel during engineering work by being able to divert away from King's Cross to St Pancras or to other London terminals when parts of the East Coast Main Line are closed. So LNER say there's further work to be done, but it was an encouraging first test. I like this sort of stuff. It's like GWR going into Euston
with a sleeper,
and with their IEPs when the Old Oak Commonwork's going on. So it's just keep the trains running.
But it starts at the top, doesn't it? You've got David Horn at LNER and Mark Hopwood at GWR.
Yeah,
died in the wool railwaymen who look at a problem and say, how can we get round this, rather than just saying, well, it's too difficult to do. So
Agreed.
Well done, David and Mark. Please keep it up. LNER really are the champions of diversions, aren't they? They do them all over the place. Here's a great one, Richard. March 29th marked the official start of S&DR200, the festival to specifically celebrate the birth of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, alongside the wider celebrations for Railway 200. 5,000 people gathered to watch the All Change Spectacular in County Durham, which featured 400 drones magically dancing through the sky. It's amazing that, isn't it? To create a miner's lamp, a railway porter, an LNER Azuma, and locomotion number 1. Sounds like an amazing event to mark the start of 9 months of celebrations. I can't get my head around the programming to get those drones to do that, but it is spectacular.
I know, yeah. Elves and pixies, I think. It's very clever people doing that.
Yeah.
RIA, the Railway Industry Association, has published a new discussion paper which sets out what they call a place-based approach to delivering better stations. It's called Stations, Engines of Communities, and it's calling for a new private and public approach to station development to fully realise the economic and social value. It includes things like investing in smaller and medium-sized stations as a portfolio, which makes sense. You kind of get away from a sort of a fragmented approach, and you can have economies of scale. Get that. Harnessing other funding sources to pay for station improvements. Using private investment models and working in close partnership with local authorities, and things like supporting housing development and so on. It's actually a really interesting paper. I mean, there's been loads and loads of let's do stuff with stations over the years, but they tend to be sort of slightly narrow and, like, well, let's see if we can put a Waitrose or an Aldi on the platform or something. This is different because it looks at ways of doing it in the context of wider policy objectives like housing growth, which is very, very important. One of the things I liked in this paper was the bit about funding things like tax incremental financing or land value capture. They sound a little bit nerdy concepts, but they could unlock a lot of money. We know that Crossrail, for instance, led to massive housing value increases as a result of being built, and capturing some of that to help pay for it is really important. So it's a really interesting paper. We'll stick a link to it on the website. Do encourage people to have a read.
That's great, because traditionally we haven't been particularly good at capturing those wider values, have we?
No.
Anyway, look, Richard, I really like this one. Some positive news from Lancashire, where...
Ooh, God's own country.
Well, it absolutely is. And what Lancashire's doing today, the rest of the world will be doing tomorrow. So it's important. Northern is running a trial to offer more assistance to older and disabled passengers on services between Preston and Colne. So hardly a glamorous but important service. During April, the operator will test a scheme that enables passengers to alert conductors of their assistance requirements up until just 10 minutes before departure at the various unstaffed stations on the East Lancs line. Alerts are sent to the conductor of the train as they are made, rather than the conductor only being notified at the start of the journey. And the idea is to make the network more accessible and extend the turn up and go experience of the railway to more people. So it's likely to make sure the assistant actually appears rather than doesn't get forgotten or overlooked in the hurly-burly of the day's job.
It's great, that, isn't it? Yeah. I sense the hand of Alex Hornby in this, the new commercial and customer director at Northern, who just gets this stuff really well. So.
He does. We must talk to him about whether they're still making people stand in the cold at Leeds, which is my big bugbear. But,
I'm sure he'll be very happy to hear. But,
Alex, if you're watching, please get in touch and talk to me about that. And that's this week's Railway News Roundup. If you've got stories for us, big ones, little ones, whatever size, from round you or wider afield, please let us know. Don't assume we already know, because stuff can slip beneath our radar, and it's better to be told many times than to miss something. We'll name check you if we use your piece, so send us an email at news@greensignals.org, and we'll take it from there.
Which means it's now time to do the quiz.
Hoorah!
Now, good, thank you. Last week's question was this.
I knew it.
A question we hoped would be a fairly straightforward
It was, because I knew the answer. It must have been.
Right, and so it proved to be, therefore, clearly. The question was, in the 1920s and 30s, there was a project on the railways that was very hush-hush. What was it, and why was it hush-hush? The answer, of course, that hush-hush was the sort of nickname given to Gresley's experimental high-pressure water tube boilered 464 locomotive, designed and built. Well, it's interesting because the boiler was built, I think, at Yarrow on the Clyde, and it was designed to run at 450 pounds per square inch PSI, which is obviously what was a standard steam locomotive, about 250. So it was a significantly
250s. I'm not sure I'd be happy with 450.
Not sure I would have wanted to be on a foot. I'm not wild about being on them at all, as you know, but that would have been a bit hairy.
Any problem or burst at 450, and you've got a huge problem, and I think that was probably a big issue.
Well, there's lots of reasons. It didn't work terribly well to begin with. Lots of things had to be amended. It was in Darlington works almost as much as it was out of it. It was actually interesting. It was the only 464 tender locomotive to run in Britain, apparently. But it wasn't a success. It spent a lot of time in Darlington Works. The engine was scrapped in 1958, but I believe the boiler, bizarrely, outlived it and was scrapped a number of years later. But there you go.
What a pity it didn't survive, Richard. Incidentally, just as an aside, do you know what the name in the white location notation is given to a 464? And it's cropped up already on this programme earlier.
So we're like, is it like Atlantic or Pacific or one of those? I don't know. What is it?
It was a Baltic.
Was it a Baltic? Well, there you go.
There you go.
Right.
Interesting, but meaningless.
There you go.
Sorry.
No, that's great. There you are. It was the only Baltic
tender. Oh no, there were tank engines. Baltic.
Yes, so it was the only 464 tender locomotive. Yeah. Anyway, the winner, randomly chosen from all the correct answers we had, and as usual, we got a lot of correct answers, was James Bolsden. Now, we think that's your full correct name, James, but that was what was in the email. So if you want to send us another email, please, to quiz@greensignals.org, we will get your quiz winner's mug sent out to you. Now, this week's quiz. I was thinking about this, 10,000 as it was, wasn't it? The Baltic that we've just talked about. And it made me think, are there other examples of one-off experimental locomotives? They could be steam or diesel, whatever you want, or even electric.
Yeah, oh God,
which actually had a shorter working life than the Baltic. In fact, what I want to know is which experimental locomotive, of which there was just the one, there was only one example, like the one we've just talked about, Baltic, that lasted for the least amount of time as an operational project. Right now, I think I know a very good candidate, but Green Signals will probably beat me to it. So that's the quiz. Please tell us if you know of an experimental locomotive which lasted the shortest period of time before it was declared unfeasible and got rid of. Answers, please, to quiz@greensignals.org. Let us know by midday on Saturday, April the 5th, and we will put all the answers into a hat, the correct ones, obviously, and draw out one at random to get a Green Signals quiz winners mug.
I'm simplifying and exaggerating here, but this could be the quiz where you've got as many different proposals as you have answers.
Good. That'd be great. That's good.
But
I learn something every day.
I'm looking forward to it as well.
Yeah.
Here's a great story to end on, Richard. Operations and Planning Project Specialist Andrew Pennington, who has appeared on this show as a guest, has been presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Well done, Andrew, at the inaugural Rail Industry Planning Awards, known as the Golden Planners. Love it. It's in recognition of his transformative impact on train planning and railway operations. Andrew currently supports the Chartered Institution of Railway Operators, CIRO, and Avanti West Coast, and he has been a pioneering figure throughout his more than 3-decade-long railway career. Well done indeed, Andrew. We salute you.
We absolutely do. He's a star, and really knows his stuff. I think railway planners are amazing people, without whom nothing would work. So they certainly deserve to be recognised, and Andrew in particular for his amazing achievements.
And it's very complex, not quite a black art, but it has a massive impact, doesn't it, on what you actually see, even
absolutely
though,
right.
know. And sadly, that's all we've got time for this week. So thanks so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel on YouTube. And if you really want to support us, find out about membership on YouTube or Patreon, for which you get all sorts of cool stuff. But most importantly, please join us again next week for this show, which will always be absolutely free. So see you then. It's sunny here. Have a great week. And till then, it's goodbye from me. And
it's goodbye from me.
Take care.